This week's reading from the Tragic Tapestry by AD Barncord is Chapter 1, Too Much of a Good Thing. Gatos looked out his window at the teeming street below. Already the shift from green to yellow was occurring in individuals. Almost instinctively he reached for the medicine bottle on the nearby shelf, but reminded himself that he had already taken his serotonin inhibitor for the day. He forced the air out of his sphericals and sat down. They were in trouble. Normally, when a Sigton world had a population surge due to favorable incubation conditions, it was just a matter of relocation of a portion of the populace to another Sigton world, thus having a population decrease, while enticing those individuals who've become gregarious to take the more dangerous careers, such as asteroid or gas giant mining. But medical science had experienced several major breakthroughs, and now it was possible to ensure the successful incubation of Sigton eggs despite the planet's current climate. And there was no planets experiencing a decrease. No place to send the Sigtons to thin the communities out. "They don't remember the swarms," he muttered to himself. Truth be told, Gatos had never lived through major storm either, but having been part of a gregarious band of nymphs growing up in a neglected part of his birth world, he had experienced it as much as a modern Sigton could. Which was why he had studied the history of swarms and the mentality that emerged from the biological changes. When he was younger and more idealistic, Gatos tried to convince people to slow down the incubation process instead of optimizing it. However, he was considered an alarmist, especially since he had a history of higher than normal paranoid behaviors. Looking back on his solutions, he had to admit that there's some major flaws in them. The greatest of which was the fact that several of his methods would have introduced developmental problems. A few senior academics took him aside and pointed out that with interstellar space travel, there was no need to worry about the population that turned on itself due to overpopulation and starvation. There were other worlds to travel to. If it were not for the swarms, the Sigton Empire would not be as powerful as it was now. Besides, who were they to ignore the destiny written in their biology? Gatos wanted to screech what it was like to be almost eaten by those you considered friends, but he couldn't face the shame of admitting how weak he was. Maybe that was the problem. His biology was flawed. He was never meant to be part of his race. He was a liability. In that case, it didn't really matter if he deliberately messed with his own hormones and neurotransmitter. They were already out of whack. He put his medicine back in its hiding place in his desk. There was no reason for anyone to know that he was deliberately cultivating his idiosyncrasies. They would never understand. Instead, he watched the people on the street, keeping track of the change of colors in their exoskeleton. Obsessively, he would monitor his own exoskeleton to see if any green was changing to yellow. He also isolated himself as much as possible to keep the hormone change from being triggered. Intellectually, Gatos knew he was risking depression, but he considered it his mind's way of keep him from becoming something horrible. Claylock came to see him after several weeks. His exoskeleton was already yellow and starting to change to orange. Usually a somber fellow, Claylock instead was talking at a happy, fast pace, telling off-color jokes. In between the jovial comments, he spoke of the Empire plans to annex new worlds for colonization. "Too bad some of the best planets are already inhabited," he said. "Maybe we can convince the Six to share their sunny worlds with us. They don't like light anyways. As long as they stay underground and we stay above, they shouldn't smell too bad. Hey, do you have anything to eat around here?" Much to Gatos' dismay, Claylock decided to drop in more and more frequently. Occasionally he would inquire about Gatos' still green exterior, but was easily distracted by questions on the plans to annex more worlds. As Claylock's exoskeleton became more darker and redder, so did his sentiments towards the nearby alien races. Instead of wanting to make a deal with the Six, he thought it'd be more prudent to conquer the female Jaspin worlds, since they were closer than the other civilization. "Aren't they rather fierce and strong?" Gatos asked. "Yeah, and they have retractable claws too," Claylock commanded. stuffing his mouth with crackers. But a Sigton is nothing if not tough. By the way, you really need to stock your pantry. A few weeks later, people no longer milled on the street below. They marched in an orderly procession. When Claylock visited, he was a scarlet color and talked about going after the human worlds instead. Why the humans? Gatos asked. They're easier to eat, Claylock explained while eating directly from the refrigerator. The thick smell funny and the jaspins are more dangerous. If we go for the humans, we can feed ourselves and then move into their cities. It was then that Gatos knew that he could no longer be a Sigden. How could he be part of a race whose response to overpopulation was to reproduce in greater numbers and eat everything in sight? Intellectually, he knew it made it easier for his species to colonize other worlds. They could afford the high mortality rate of adjusting to new climate. But why couldn't they become less fertile as their population grew? Why hadn't he bothered to study other species more to learn how they coped with overpopulation instead of fixating on the historical swarming behaviors? He contemplated several actions, from spiking the water supplies with serotonin inhibitors to sabotaging a spaceport. But he didn't have the resources or means to do these things. What more, he didn't have the energy to do it. A week later, when Claylock came for his now daily visits, his exoskeleton was now a dark reddish brown. Gatos numbly sat there as he announced that the Empire had finalized its plans. It would attack all three races. The attack would be coordinated to keep the aliens from alerting each other of the Satan's threat before it was too late. Claylock was so ravenous that he no longer considered the potential foul smell of the Thicks to be a hurdle to eating them. He left, not even realizing that Gatos had not spoken a word. Gatos went to a supply of medicine. He put several bottles in his desk, then got a pitcher of water from his kitchen. When Claylock found his dead body the next day, he found 7 empty bottles next to it. For a brief moment, the idea of eating his longtime colleague crossed his mind. But then he remembered himself that Gatos' corpse was probably poisonous. He called law enforcement instead and let them have the honors.